Hello, my name is Jim Glover. I work for the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, and I'm in the Bureau of Water. And I manage the aquatic biology section, and one of the things we do here is go out and sample streams and rivers for these organisms called macroinvertebrates. The macroinvertebrate lacks a backbone, and it's also big enough to see with the naked eye. So what staff here at DHEC do is collect these organisms, bring them back to the laboratory, and identify them, usually to species, with a microscope and using various keys. And it takes a long time to learn to do this sort of activity. But with the South Carolina Adopt a Stream, a higher level of taxonomic category can be used, and almost anyone can be trained to do it with a minimal amount of effort. With the South Carolina Adopt a Stream program, you have sensitive organisms which will not be present in polluted water or present in low numbers, somewhat sensitive that are in sort of the mid-grade stream or river that has a little pollution. And then if a stream or river is highly polluted, you may find exclusively these tolerant taxa. The score sheet of the South Carolina Adopt a Stream will allow for a score to be given that will allow citizens to determine if a stream is in excellent condition, poor condition, or somewhere in between. We're going to look now at some of these organisms, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of the different taxa and a little bit about their life histories and show some of their diversity. We're going to start here with some of the caddisflies. Caddisflies are aquatic insects that are related to moths and butterflies. They live about a year or so under the water, and then they eventually emerge and fly away. But one of the unique things and very interesting is that most caddisflies build some kind of case, and they build different sizes and shapes of cases depending on the species. So here's one that's built a case out of stone. So it's taken little pieces of stone and used these things called silky salivary secretions to glue these stones together with silk, just like a silkworm, which is a moth, can do. These can do also. The adults, in fact, look like little moths somewhat, and not as showy and as fascinating as these underwater, the subaquatic forms. This is one that has taken two leaves, clipped it with its mandibles, and has glued it together, and it lives inside this little case. There are some that are much smaller. You can see this one is a type of caddisfly that builds a case that has sort of rectangular sides, and this one is one that has uses little pieces of roots that it cuts and glues together in spiral form. Some use stones, some use sticks. That one's trying to swim away. You can see maybe it has its rear legs it can beat like oars, and it can swim a little bit, but usually they cling on to the benthic part. So a little worm-like creature lives in these cases. If you don't know what you're looking at, you might think it's just a stick, and that they are in fact called stick insects by some people. So these are all sensitive to pollution. If you find lots of different kinds like we have here, that means the stream, along with some of these others, is in pretty good condition. This is a mayfly right here. You can see it's a flat one if we can get it in the frame. One of the characteristics of mayflies are they have three tails. If you see an aquatic invertebrate that has three tails, it's probably a mayfly, although some damselflies have three gills. It may look like tails. Here's one that's a swimmer. You can see how fast maybe it's swimming around. It looks like a little fish sometimes, but it's a mayfly, and they come in all shapes and sizes. There's a very small mayfly. This one is a sprawler, as they call it, and it'll live on the bottom or on rocks, sometimes in very swift water. The ephemeroptera live about 1 year under the water, and then they eventually emerge and will live for only about a day. Some will live as short as 90 minutes. So obviously the males and females have to find each other pretty quick. They reproduce. The female will fly up through the swarm of males in something called a nuptial flight. One of the males will capture the female, they'll reproduce. The female lays eggs in the water, and then she dies, and the generation starts anew. These organisms in adult form don't have moving, functional mouth parts or digestive systems. So, they live mostly underwater in our rivers and streams and lakes, and they come in all shapes and sizes and lots of diversity, but they're also very sensitive to pollution, so it's good to have lots of different kinds of these in a river stream. Probably the most sensitive to pollution, and that's a stonefly. Here's a fairly large stonefly, and they too come in different shapes and sizes. This stonefly is rather flat. It has two tails, and it also will emerge from the water, fly away. These live a little longer in adult forms. In the adults, they will hit their heads against sticks, the males will, called drumming, and that is an attempt to attract females. And different species that's found, scientists have found, can drum in different ways depending on the species. Here's another, but these have two tails. And if you find lots of these, that generally means the river and stream is in good condition, and so we like to see those. Some other things on the sensitive category for the South Carolina Adopt a Stream program are these organisms called gilled snails. And snails are pretty easy to tell. The gilled snail has this hard little door called an operculum that it uses to shut up and it protects itself against predators. So those are good to see, some different kinds of those as well. There's a few others on the list. Water penny larvae, we don't see those a tremendous amount in South Carolina. These are usually just in the mountains, but it looks like a penny. Sort of, it's kind of copper shaped, and you could overlook these fairly easily, but once you start knowing what you're looking for, you can see them. But these organisms are flat on the rock, and they kind of do look like a penny. They're copper colored. They're a beetle. They're a water penny beetle. Water penny beetles are both in the larval and the adult stage, live underwater. So those are in the sensitive categories as well. Okay, so here's an adult riffle beetle. And this little creature is a beetle, Coleoptera, and it lives under the water. And these are sensitive organisms, and we can you'll find those in unpolluted streams. So we looked at the sensitive taxa for the South Carolina Adopt a Stream. Now we're going to look at the somewhat sensitive. That is, they can tolerate a little bit of pollution, but if it's highly polluted, they too will not be able to survive. So this net spinning caddisfly doesn't build a case that it carries around on its back. Rather, it builds a little lean-to like structure on a rock or a log, and it builds a little net at the front of it, and it's almost like a fishing net that it uses. It faces upstream usually, and it filters out various kinds of particles from the water that it uses for food. So it's almost like it's sieving the water, and then it'll come out just with its head and graze off of that with the various things it catches, algae and detritus and other little pieces of organic material. You rarely get, or really never get, the lean-to because it's attached to the rock or stick, but you do get the organism. You can tell that it's the caddisfly if you zoom in or you have a hand lens by looking and seeing that it has gills. It's an insect, so it has 6 legs, and it has really hard body parts for the head, and it's what we call the thorax, which is the segments right posterior to the head. Sometimes these can be very, very abundant in rivers and streams that have a little bit of organic pollution, because the organic pollution is actually providing food for them. So it may kill, some of it may kill the stoneflies, for example, but for these guys, they like it because they're getting more organic matter that they can eat. And they'll live about a year under the water. Eventually they'll pupate like a moth or a caterpillar will, that turns into a moth or butterfly, and they will eventually emerge from the water and will fly away, and they'll live about a month and reproduce and lay eggs, and the next generation will begin. Now this big creature, this is a type of dragonfly. Most people have seen these creatures in the adult stage flying around. A dragonfly holds its wings, the adult, out away from its body when it's at rest. But most of its life, these organisms live under the water, and few people have seen these, although they're very common in our rivers and streams across the world, really, including here in South Carolina. They're predators, all of them. They're in the order Odonata. And odo, like orthodontist, means teeth, and so they have these huge teeth. And they have a lower labium that it uses to reach out and grab its prey. Some of these are so large in the nymphal stage like this, they can even catch little fish and eat them. So they're voracious predators. They're somewhat sensitive, so you can find these, again, just like the net-spitting caddisfly, in rivers and streams that are somewhat polluted. Its close relative is the damselfly. And the damselfly is different from the dragonfly. They both are predators. They both have that big lower labium, the lower lip that it can reach out and grab things. And they both have those big teeth. It looks like he has 3 tails, and they are frequently confused with the mayfly, but those aren't tails, they're gills, and you can see that they're not tails like the mayfly because they're not very slender and tubular. These are kind of flat on each side. Unlike the dragonfly that has internal gills in its posterior end, the damselfly in its nymphal stage has gills that are external, and you can see them. So this is a type of damselfly. So dragonflies and damselflies are somewhat sensitive to pollution. And there's lots of different kinds, shapes, sizes, and for those who've been by a creek or lake, you've seen the different kinds of dragonflies and damselflies in different colors, and some people even like to count them and learn them just for recreation or as a hobby. But usually those are the adults. They'll live about 2 years underwater. They'll emerge, and unlike a lot of these other aquatic insects, they feed. They're voracious feeders. In fact, they are true dragons of the sky to little insects, especially mosquitoes. People like seeing them because they think they can help with control some of the mosquito population, and it's true that they can. So crayfish, most people know what crayfish are. There's over 30 species of crayfish in South Carolina. There's not a large number of genera, but you can always tell a crayfish. They're a crustacean. They're not insects, so they don't have wings. They don't fly. They live their entire life under the water. Unlike insects, they have 5 appendages on each side as opposed to 3 on each side, being crustaceans. Some people call these crawdads. There's really no right or wrong way of saying it. We say crayfish. You could call them crawdads, crawfish. It just depends on the part of the country you're in. A lot of people use these for food. There are some endangered and threatened species in South Carolina, and there's also some invasive species, especially the ones that people raise in aquaculture that may have been escaped into our waters. And like most invasive species, they can cause some damage to the native species. So that's a somewhat sensitive species as well. We have the hellgrammite also. This is also a big predator. And these are one of the invertebrates that kind of bite you a little bit if you pick it up wrong. They have these big mandibles. They're voracious predators. People fish with these in some places. They catch them. These also will emerge from the water, lay their eggs. If you see little white dots that look kind of like maybe nets of a spider on bridges and pilings and other things, when you're at a creek, you'll see them all over the place. That's the egg case of these. They have wings. They'll fly up there after they reproduce, lay their eggs near the water, not in the water, and eventually those eggs will hatch and the little hellgrammites will fall into the water and the generation will begin again. We have lots of clams and mussels in fresh water. Not as much as in salt water, but there's many. There's probably 30 or so species of mussels. Some of them get quite large. These are just some we've picked up here in streams and rivers in South Carolina, and they're somewhat sensitive to pollution. Of course, they don't emerge. They don't even move too much. The interesting thing about these organisms is they have to have a fish host, and some of the species have to have the exact kind of fish host to survive. And they'll live many, many years, some of them. Lots of endangered species of freshwater mussels throughout the country, and we have one officially endangered, the Carolina hill splitter here in South Carolina. One of the concerns with these organisms is that if the fish host becomes extinct, then they'll eventually also become extinct. And we don't really know the fish host for all of the different species. And some use multiple fish, but the tiny little larval stage of a mussel will attach onto a fish gill, and it has to go through that cycle in order to eventually grow a shell and fall to the bottom and start growing into this mussel that you see. At one time they used these for buttons before plastic was invented, and you can find photos on the web of mountains of these from the Ohio and Mississippi River that they have dredged up for the button industry, and that can be part of the problem with why some of them are endangered, but also habitat destruction and pollution and other things. This one here happens to be invasive. It's called Asiatic clam. Corbicula is a genus, and some people just say corbicula. It came over this mid-past century, and it's become widespread throughout South Carolina. At this point, you'd almost want to call it naturalized instead of invasive, because it's so common and part of the fauna now. Somewhat sensitive. If you've seen in your house, and most everyone has, these large things that look like mosquitoes that are bouncing back and forth against the wall, some people call them mosquito hawks. These are crane flies, and the crane fly larvae. Look, this is the creature right here. Looks like a big maggot almost. It is a diptera, just like a housefly or anything else. But the larvae, for the most part, live under the water. There are some terrestrial ones too. Somewhat sensitive to pollution. The crane fly larvae, just a big, no legs, just like fly maggots, but it has a little head, and that's its head. You can see it's moving in that direction. There's a few other crustaceans besides crayfish. There are things called aquatic sow bugs and scuds. This is a sow bug, an isopod. It's a crustacean. Kind of looks like a roly-poly. It's one of the few terrestrial crustaceans or pill bugs you might have seen as a kid or even as an adult. But this creature is aquatic, and it's somewhat sensitive, but like all crustaceans, it has 5 legs on each side, so it has 10 legs, and you can tell that using your hand lens. Sometimes these can be very abundant, especially in our low country. You see these more in our low country than you do up in the Piedmont and in the mountains. So this is another somewhat sensitive creature, and it's the scud. It's an amphipod. It's a crustacean, just like the isopod. The difference between an isopod and an amphipod is this one, the amphipod, is what scientists like to say is laterally compressed. The aquatic sow bug is what scientists like to say are dorsoventrally compressed, so it's flat. And that's a good way to tell them apart. And both of these are found in high numbers in sort of our swampy streams or low country. You'll find them in the upstate, but they're much more common below the fall line. Somewhat sensitive. All right, so we're going to go to the tolerant taxa now. And these organisms, unless it is just really, really a toxic spill or highly polluted, will be found sometimes in high numbers, because often if there's the diversity has been reduced because of pollution, there's less competition, there may not be other predators here, and these organisms can survive in lots of different conditions. I've seen, probably in my career here at DHEC, only one time that everything was killed in a creek, and that was a long time ago. It was a cyanide spill. Most people have are familiar with leeches. And there's actually a lot of leeches in our rivers and streams. Some are ectoparasites. They'll latch onto turtles and other mammals, and even a human if they're wading around without protection or without shoes. But for the most part, a lot of these leeches are free living, and they might just be predators. These are related to a worm, like an earthworm that you might see. They're annelids. But unlike earthworms, they have suckers on each of the front and the back. You can see this moving along. It helps them hold on to, if they're an ectoparasite, to its host, and then once it latches in, it starts sucking blood. Here's a bigger and a flatter one. Lots of different species. Nothing to be afraid of with these. A lot of people get freaked out a little bit with leeches, but they're really not harmful. And they're just there doing their job like every other aquatic organism, trying to make a living. And in this case, a lot of them are predators. You might see these attached to a turtle or a fish or a mammal such as a beaver. So they have filled that niche, but in this case, in aquatic systems. They are tolerant, so you can find those just like other worms, aquatic worms in very polluted systems. So the lung snail can live in water that is very low in dissolved oxygen. And it has an organ that allows it to extract oxygen even when it's at very low levels. So naturally, in polluted streams where the dissolved oxygen might be low, it's still doing okay. The way you can tell the difference between this creature, the lung snail, and the gilled snail is the gilled snail has that hard door, the operculum, and you have your hand lens and a pair of forceps. You can kind of poke on that door and feel that it's hard, but this one lacks that, and so this is a tolerant creature. A little bit hard to tell. Here's another type of one that's much smaller, and if you have your hand lens, you can tell that it lacks that door, the operculum. And so again, these would be in very large numbers in or potentially in polluted water. So there's aquatic worms. If you see a long creature that looks like sort of an earthworm, sometimes it looks a lot like an earthworm, but they're usually a lot skinnier. You can tell them apart from the leeches, because, especially in a pan like this, because they don't have these suctions, so they don't move about like that. They sort of just wiggle around, and they often live in the sediment and the aquatic worms, and they're very tolerant to pollution. Sometimes you'll find these by the thousands within polluted streams. The last two things here in the tolerant category are midges and black flies. These are both diptera. That means they have two wings. Their adults only have two wings and maybe a little tiny vestigial wing on the back. So di means two, and ptera is wing. The midges as adults look like mosquitoes, look a lot like mosquitoes, but they won't bite you, and there's lots and lots of different kinds. There might be a little bit hard for you to distinguish in the field between these and a worm, but if you have your hand lens, you can use it to see these midges have a very hard head, which a worm doesn't have, and some of them have a little thing called a proleg that comes right out under their head. A lot of people, especially from the upper Midwest, know all about black flies or buffalo gnats. They will bite you and they hurt. The adults will. We don't seem to have a big problem with them down here, but you do find the larvae a fair amount in our creeks and rivers. They have almost look like a club, the whole body, with this being the posterior end. It has a little row of hooks, a round rosette of hooks that it uses to attach itself to a rock, and then it sticks its head up in flowing water. Almost all black fly larvae filter out organic material that it's getting from flowing water. Almost all of these require flowing water. They're all over the world, lots of species, but both of these organisms in the South Carolina Adopt-a-Stream protocols are in the tolerant category. Okay, so once you've gone to your creek and you've recorded all the different creatures that you've seen, the South Carolina Adopted Stream Protocol will allow you to determine if the creek is in excellent shape, good shape, fair shape, or poor shape. Over time, you can use these data to track changes, or it may even tell you whether there was a spill or something that occurred. DHEC is very excited about this program, and we're very excited about all the citizen scientists who've been going out and who are going to be volunteering to look at our streams and rivers. Your work is very important. If you ever have challenges identifying any of these creatures that you might see, give us a call and we're here to help. Thank you.